My ex-boyfriend, a military man, showed up drunk on my doorstep the night before my wedding. I remember the night my ex-boyfriend Andrew first walked into my life. It was the last place I ever expected to meet someone who would eventually become so significant. A cramped classroom on a Friday afternoon, where our teacher had just announced the pairings for a volunteer project we were meant to organize as part of our final high school semester. I was leaning against a desk, mentally counting down the seconds until the bell rang, when he walked up with an outstretched hand and an awkward grin. We both laughed about how neither of us wanted to do the project, but somehow, the instant we started talking, there was an energy, almost a spark, that neither of us could ignore. We were both young, prone to dramatic fantasies about love, and we spent the early days of our relationship in that dizzying haze of discovery. We'd chat after school, spend hours texting about nothing and everything, walk to the park, and imagine a future so distant and ill-formed it was practically a fairy tale. In those moments, Andrew felt like a best friend, someone who looked at me with genuine curiosity, who could make me laugh by simply doing a silly dance or telling a ridiculous joke. Looking back on it now, I think we were both in love with the idea of being. We officially became a couple during that summer that bridged high school and whatever lay next. Neither of us had a clear plan for our futures, and while I eventually decided to aim for a university in another city, Andrew drifted. He took a few months off, then hopped between part-time jobs, never quite sure of what he wanted. In the beginning, I found that aspect of him oddly charming, like he was a free spirit who refused to be tied down. But slowly, as I grew more focused on my own academic goals, that same lack of direction in him started to concern me. I began to worry about our differences, about how I was determined to leave our hometown to pursue a degree, while he seemed content to stay rooted in place, half trying new things but never committing. Despite the mounting tension, we stayed together for 2 years. There were afternoons I adored him, when he made me laugh until I cried, when he remembered small details that showed how much he paid attention to who I was. There were also days when we fought so bitterly that I'd lock myself in the bathroom, tears spilling down my cheeks, and wonder why we were clinging so fiercely to something that felt so shaky. Looking back, I see now that we were kids who liked the comfort of each other's company, but we didn't have the tools or maturity to navigate real adult challenges. As the date for my move to the university drew closer, it became clear that neither of us truly wanted to work through the distance or the effort it would take to maintain a healthy relationship. One day, it was simply over. We'd argued the night before. We'd each said things we regretted, and in the morning, as the sun filtered in through the curtains, we sat in the stillness and agreed that it wasn't working. There were tears. There was heartbreak, especially on his side, but a sense of finality was in the air, and in my mind, the chapter of us was firmly closing. I packed my boxes, said my goodbyes, and went off to start the next phase of my life. I thought about him occasionally in the following weeks, especially at night, when the reality of dorm life was new and unsettling. But as time passed, I let him fade into a distant memory, a relationship that was a crucible for lessons about heartbreak, immaturity, and the emotional turbulence of young love. 5 years later, my life was on a vastly different track. I had completed my studies, found a job I genuinely cared about, made friends with people who understood me in ways I never experienced back in my hometown. More importantly, I met Ryan, the man who would become my fiancé, a steady, kind, infinitely patient person whose presence made me feel secure from day one. We'd met at a campus seminar during my last year. We started out as study partners, staying up late in the library to go over econ assignments, fueled by too much coffee and a mutual sense of humor that quickly melted the usual awkwardness of new friendships. By the end of that semester, we were spending almost every weekend together, cooking meals in the cramped kitchen of my apartment, taking spontaneous trips to the city's museums, or strolling down the riverbank to watch the lights dance on the water. For the first time, I felt like I was with someone who genuinely saw me, who accepted my flaws and fears, and who was ready to face the world at my side. The proposal, when it came, was sweet and intimate. He asked me during a picnic in the very spot by the river where we'd gone on one of our earliest dates. He pulled out a ring, simple, elegant, and said words that choked me up instantly. "I just want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" That was all it took. My answer was an ecstatic yes, accompanied by tears and a trembling smile that refused to leave my face for hours. From that moment on, we began weaving plans for a shared future, a quiet wedding with a few dozen loved ones, maybe in a garden or an old vineyard we'd once visited. We'd been living together for months by then, and our apartment felt like a true home, warm, peaceful, filled with laughter. I often marveled at how different Ryan was from Andrew. Where Andrew was quick to anger or frustration, Ryan was patient. Where Andrew was aimless, Ryan had a sense of direction without being rigid. He was supportive, understanding, and I never felt belittled or judged when I talked about my dreams. There were nights we would stay up talking about our careers, our future kids, The idea of maybe living abroad for a year or two just to experience a different culture. Everything felt open and possible. I'd never been so certain of anything as I was about marrying this. It was the most normal of evenings when Andrew reappeared in my life out of nowhere. Ryan and I were finishing dinner, sitting on our couch in our pajamas, debating which movie to watch. The doorbell rang, echoing through the living room. We exchanged a puzzled glance. Neither of us was expecting company. Usually, a spontaneous visitor might be a neighbor needing something, or maybe a package delivery that was too large for the mailbox. Ryan got up to answer, and I trailed behind him out of curiosity. The second he opened the door, the sight that greeted us slammed me with a wave of confusion and alarm. There stood Andrew, reeking of alcohol, disheveled hair, eyes bloodshot, tie hanging lopsided around his neck as though he'd been in a fight with it. My heart jumped into my throat. I took an involuntary step back, instantly feeling Ryan glance over at me in concern. Andrew just stood there, blinking slowly, and then tears began to roll down his cheeks. He was sobbing, incoherently at first, saying something like, "Can't believe he's real. Can't believe you're both real." I had no idea what he meant. My head spun with questions. Why was he here? How did he know my address? What prompted him to come at all? Ryan, in his ever-patient way, reached out a hand and said, "Hey, are you all right, man? You look not great. Do you need help?" Andrew nodded in this muddled, desperate way, like a lost child. He was clearly intoxicated, and it was close to 10 p.m., so we had no idea what to do but let him inside. It felt dangerous to leave him out in the hallway. He looked like he could barely stand. We eased him onto our couch. He stared at me through bleary eyes, voice trembling, apologizing in fits and starts for things that happened years ago, apologizing for turning up like this. He said something about being in the city for his bachelor party, and a shockwave went through me. Bachelor party? He was engaged? If so, why was he at my doorstep? Every syllable he uttered was loaded with self-pity and regret. He kept saying he never got over how we ended, that he believed we could have made it work if I hadn't moved away, that his behavior had been wrong. Then he stumbled over his words, tears streaming. He tried to stand but swayed dangerously. Ryan and I exchanged a look, a silent agreement to handle this carefully. In all his drunken rambling, Andrew didn't seem violent, just heartbroken or perhaps terrified. Still, it was jarring. I fetched him a glass of water while Ryan gently ushered him toward the bathroom, where Andrew immediately threw up. The smell was terrible, and I had flashbacks to nights long ago when I'd held Andrew's hair back during parties if he had one too many drinks. It felt eerily familiar and profoundly wrong at the same time. This was my ex, someone I hadn't thought about in so long. Yet here he was, sobbing, vomiting in my bathroom, while my fiancé calmly patted his back and handed him a towel. The strangeness of it almost made me laugh, but the pity in my chest kept me solemn. Between heaves, Andrew choked out bits of explanation. He'd been bar hopping with his friends, who knew he still held some unresolved sorrow about our past. Egged on by too many shots, he decided to pull up my address. Apparently, he'd found it through mutual acquaintances or social media, and he took a taxi to my place. He said he felt compelled to see me, to look me in the eye, and express how he regretted the way things ended. The entire situation felt surreal, like a scene from a poorly written drama. Once he'd emptied the contents of his stomach, we tried to get some coffee into him, thinking maybe it would help him sober up. He mumbled an apology, asked if we had waffles of all things. I don't know why, maybe some fragment of memory told him that waffles helped with hangovers. Coincidentally, I did have some in the freezer, so we heated them up, placed them on a plate, and he tried to nibble between hiccuping sobs. I mostly stood there, arms folded, watching him. I couldn't muster anger. The entire sight was too pitiful. I felt something like compassion mixed with disquiet. Ryan quietly asked if Andrew had any phone numbers for his groomsmen or friends, but Andrew just shook his head, saying they were still out partying somewhere, and he didn't want to see them right now. Then he said something that caught me off guard. I kept telling them about you, about how I messed it all up, and they said to just let it go, but I couldn't. I tried to respond calmly. Andrew, that was years ago. I've moved on. You need to move on too. You have someone you're about to marry, right? Isn't that what you told me? But my words sounded hollow, and he just lowered his head, tears sliding down his cheeks. Eventually, he said he was going to call an Uber to go back to his hotel. We helped him stand, found his phone, and waited while he tapped at the screen with shaking fingers. I insisted that he send us a message when he arrived, so we'd know he got there safe. Before he left, he looked at Ryan with a remorseful expression and said something like, "Take care of her. Don't do what I did." Ryan just nodded, guiding him gently out of the apartment. After Andrew was gone, Ryan closed the door softly, and the lock clicked with a finality that felt like exorcising a ghost. We stood there in a heavy silence, the tension in the room almost tangible. I remember swallowing hard, my heartbeat still unsteady. Ryan finally asked, "Are you okay?" And I realized I was shaking. It was a strange mixture of sadness, confusion, and a touch of anger at having our peaceful evening disrupted. Mostly, though, I was overwhelmed with a sense of dirtiness, like I'd been thrust into a secret I never wanted to be part of. We cleaned up the mess in the bathroom, disinfected the toilet, threw the soiled towels in the washing machine. Ryan tried to lighten the mood by making a small joke about adding emergency waffle caretaker to his resume. I appreciated the attempt, but I stayed subdued. Even as we settled back onto the couch, my mind kept replaying Andrew's tear-streaked face, the slur in his voice, the painful honesty of his confession. I expected a troubled night's sleep, and that's exactly what I got. I tossed and turned, half expecting to hear another frantic buzz at the door. When I did drift off, I had a nightmare of Andrew knocking on my door over and over, yelling how he needed closure, while his fiancée stood by his side, looking betrayed and furious. I woke up sweating, Ryan's arms around me, softly reminding me it was just a dream. The next morning, the question of telling Andrew's fiancée about his late-night visit came roaring into my mind. My personal moral compass said that if I were about to marry someone who did that, I'd want to know. But I also wasn't sure if meddling was the right move. Maybe Andrew would come clean on his own, or maybe telling his fiancée would look like I was trying to sabotage their relationship. Over coffee, I asked Ryan for his opinion. He sipped quietly for a moment, then said, "I'd want to know, but it's also not really your secret to share." I ended up seeking advice from a few trusted friends who all offered varying takes. Some believed I should inform her immediately that she deserved full transparency. Others felt I should keep my distance because if Andrew was dealing with personal demons, it wasn't my responsibility to fix or expose them. A few even warned me about how telling her might blow up in my face, painting me as the villain who tried to interfere in their upcoming marriage. None of those possibilities sounded appealing. Finally, I settled on a compromise. I contacted Andrew's sister, Taylor, who I used to be friendly with. We'd lost touch, but I still had her number. I sent her a text explaining, calmly, that Andrew had appeared at my apartment drunk, that he was upset, and that I just wanted someone in his close circle to be aware so they could make sure he was okay. She responded with relief and embarrassment. She apologized on his behalf, saying that he'd been acting strangely for weeks, going on emotional rants, drinking more than usual, and generally worrying everyone around. I breathed a little easier knowing that someone in his family would keep an eye on it, and I sincerely hoped it ended there. For a couple of days, that was the end of it. Then, unexpectedly, I got another frantic call from Taylor saying Andrew hadn't shown up at his wedding ceremony. He'd seemingly vanished. Family and friends were scrambling to find him, and someone mentioned that maybe he'd run off to see me again. "He's not with me," I told Taylor, my heart pounding at the thought that his disappearance could somehow be linked to our odd encounter. She believed me, but I could hear the panic in her voice. I felt a surge of sympathy for Taylor, for Andrew's fiancée, for everyone caught in this whirlwind. A day later, I got a call from an unknown number. My gut told me it might be Andrew's fiancée, and I was right. The second I picked up, a shaky voice demanded to know if Andrew and I had slept together. Her tone was a tangled mix of anger, heartbreak, and desperation. She was convinced there had been some intimate betrayal, as apparently the best man told her Andrew had gone to my place. My own anger flared for a moment. I didn't appreciate being accused of something so outrageous. But the heartbreak in her voice quickly replaced my irritation with compassion. I explained exactly what happened, that nothing happened. Andrew showed up drunk and emotional. I fed him coffee and waffles and sent him home in an Uber. Ryan was there the whole time. I emphasized that I had zero romantic interest in Andrew. She started crying softly, apologizing for accusing me, confessing that her mind had run wild after he disappeared. I told her I was sorry for what she was going through, that I wouldn't wish it on anyone. There was a hollow resignation in her voice when she said they were done, that the wedding was off, the guests had been turned away, and Andrew was still nowhere in sight. It turned out that Andrew had fled to France, of all places. Taylor called me a few days later to say he'd finally resurfaced. He told his family he couldn't go through with the wedding, that it was all a huge mistake. They were furious, his parents ashamed, and his would-be bride left humiliated and devastated. It was the ultimate runaway groom scenario. Taylor also informed me, somewhat bizarrely, that Andrew had confessed to stealing one of my lipsticks from my apartment the night he'd come over. I think my brain short-circuited for a second, trying to process that. When had he had the opportunity? Why a lipstick? Taylor said he'd claimed it was some sort of keepsake, like he'd wanted to hold on to something tangible from me. She ended up sending me money to replace it, apologizing yet again for her brother's behavior. I was half disturbed, half pitying him for such a strange, sentimental theft. In the aftermath, the pieces fell in different ways for different people. Andrew broke off the engagement officially. His now ex-fiancée was left reeling, and from what I heard, many people blamed him for leading her on for so long when he apparently hadn't even closed the door on his past. He moved back in with his parents for a while, then sought some therapy, or so Taylor told me. I didn't ask for more details. I felt it was best to close that chapter and not keep up with every turn of his drama. I had enough on my plate with planning my own wedding and trying to move forward. At first, I wrestled with guilt. Was I in some way responsible for Andrew's meltdown? If I'd never dated him or broken up with him the way I did, would he be more emotionally stable now? Rationally, I knew it wasn't my fault. We had parted ways years ago. He was a grown man making his own choices. Still, I couldn't help but feel a pang of remorse, thinking about how a single late-night encounter seemed to have set off a chain of events culminating in an abandoned wedding. Over time, though, I came to see it as something that probably would have happened regardless. Andrew's feelings, whatever they were, had clearly been brewing. Maybe seeing me forced him to confront them, and in an odd roundabout way, it might have saved him from marrying someone he wasn't truly committed to. It certainly spared the fiancé from a marriage with a man full of regrets and confusion. Ryan was a quiet pillar of support throughout all of this. He never got jealous, never blamed me, never tried to escalate any drama. If I brought it up, he'd listen calmly, nodding in empathy, reminding me that Andrew's actions were Andrew's alone. Sometimes, late at night, I'd curl up beside him and we'd talk about how unpredictable life could be. One random visit from my ex turned so many lives upside down. We both felt compassion for the bride, who'd been left without a groom, and even for Andrew, whose unresolved issues had led to such turmoil. But mostly, we felt gratitude that our relationship was built on honesty and trust, that we were in a good place heading into our own marriage. As the months passed, the entire fiasco became a strange anecdote. I'd tell a few close friends over a glass of wine, half laughing at the absurdity of it, half shuddering at how painful it must have been for everyone directly involved. Taylor called me once more to say Andrew was attempting to straighten out his life, to maybe pursue a fresh start in another city. She thanked me for the way I'd handled things, for not adding fuel to the fire or using the situation for gossip. I thanked her in return, wished them well, and we parted on good terms. That was the last time we spoke. Meanwhile, my wedding day arrived, and it was as beautiful and joyous as I'd imagined. We held the ceremony in a vineyard just outside the city, with rows of grapes stretching across rolling hills, a gentle breeze rustling the leaves overhead. I walked down the aisle on my father's arm, my heart pounding with excitement. Ryan stood at the altar looking handsome, his eyes brimming with emotion. Our vows felt like poetry, promises to love and protect, to be patient, to grow together through everything life might throw our way. I remembered, briefly, the chaos that Andrew had brought back into my life, and it only underscored how thankful I was to have found a man like Ryan, who never made me feel second best or anchored to past regrets. Surrounded by friends and family, we sealed our commitment with a kiss, and I felt a surge of hope for the future so strong that it nearly took my breath away. Afterward, at the reception under twinkling string lights, I danced with Ryan, giddy with the realization that this was the life I had chosen, one full of love and genuine partnership. At one point, my phone buzzed in my clutch, and I saw a brief message from Taylor. He just wanted you to know he's sorry for everything. I hope you're having a beautiful day. I showed it to Ryan. He squeezed my hand and smiled in that gentle way of his. I never responded, and maybe that was closure in itself. I had acknowledged his pain, I had tried to help in the little ways I could, and I'd moved on. Andrew's apology was the coda, a quiet final note to our shared history. That night, I danced until my feet were sore, laughed with my guests, and fell asleep in Ryan's arms, grateful and happy beyond words. In reflecting on it all, I realized that sometimes people from our past aren't as distant as we think. They can carry torches for years. Torches made of regret or guilt or longing. Those flames might flare up unexpectedly, threatening to cast shadows on the present we've built for ourselves. But at the end of the day, we have a choice in how we respond. We can choose honesty, compassion, and firmness. We can set boundaries that protect our peace without completely shutting out empathy. We can acknowledge that people change, or fail to change, and that it's not our job to carry the weight of their unprocessed emotions. Yes, the story left a trail of heartbreak for Andrew's ex-fiancée, now presumably living her own new chapter somewhere, hopefully healing, and a swirl of embarrassment and regret for Andrew himself. But for me, it ultimately reaffirmed what I already knew. I had found my real partner, a love that was stable, supportive, built on healthy communication, and ready to face life side by side. Andrew reminded me, quite painfully, that not everyone finds that without first wading through confusion and turmoil. Some never find it at all because they sabotage themselves before they can receive it. I hope he heals. I hope he genuinely grows and can open himself to real love one day, one that he won't sabotage or abandon at the last minute. I hope Maria, his ex-fiancée, finds someone who truly cherishes her, free of the baggage that Andrew never seemed able to let go of. Meanwhile, my present life is exactly what I wanted, happily married to the man of my dreams, forging our shared future with excitement and contentment. Andrew's late-night doorbell visit may be a story I tell for years to come, an anecdote about how strange life can be, how the past can collide with the present in unexpected ways. Yet it'll always remain just that, a surreal tale from the past, a memory that underscores how far I've come and how deeply I value the future I'm living. And that's enough. But life, of course, rarely stops offering lessons once a dramatic chapter has closed. In the weeks after my wedding, there were moments when I found myself revisiting everything that had happened with Andrew in my thoughts. Late at night, while Ryan slept soundly, I would stare at the ceiling, mind drifting to that jarring doorbell, the way Andrew's voice had trembled as he tried to apologize, and the haunted look in his eyes that suggested he was battling far more than the aftermath of a breakup from years ago. I wondered if perhaps he had carried guilt so heavy that it distorted the rest of his life choices. Maybe he never really forgave himself for letting our relationship slip away, or for the things he'd done that contributed to our downfall. It made me realize how crucial it is to seek real closure, even if it's only with ourselves. I also came to see how differently people handle heartache. In our case, I moved away for university, and that separation forced me to adapt, to meet new people, to form new routines. It was a shock to my system at the time, but it meant I was severed from the environment and patterns that tied me to Andrew. That distance helped me heal and reflect. Andrew, on the other hand, remained in our hometown, grappling with old reminders and perhaps never fully reconciling what had happened between us. Part of me still felt sympathy because the path he took led him to a point where his unresolved pain erupted just when he was supposed to be celebrating the promise of a new marriage. Over time, as I settled into life as a newlywed, I noticed a renewed dedication within myself to nurture the relationship I had with Ryan. Watching Andrew unravel so dramatically was like a cautionary tale of what could happen if unspoken truths and regrets are left unaddressed. Ryan and I began having more frequent heart-to-heart talks about anything and everything, our anxieties, our wishes, our concerns, big or small, just to ensure nothing would ever fester. We made plans to travel together, to strengthen our bond through shared experiences. We visited new cities, tasted local cuisines, took thousands of photos, laughed until our stomachs hurt. In the back of my mind, I occasionally recalled how Andrew and I had once fantasized about traveling the world, but it had never crystallized into a real plan. Now, with Ryan, these desires were transforming into real-life adventures, and I felt a deep sense of gratitude. A few months after our wedding, I received a text from a mutual friend who'd known both me and Andrew back in high school. She said she'd run into him at a coffee shop near our old neighbor. Apparently, he looked tired but was sober and more composed. He briefly mentioned going to therapy, trying to patch up some family relationships, and looking for a more stable job. He didn't say much else, and the friend didn't pry. It gave me a small sense of relief to hear he was attempting to straighten out his life. I hoped it meant he was finally confronting the unresolved feelings that had led him to flee his own wedding. Part of me wished him true peace and happiness, because no matter how tumultuous our shared history was, I never wished him ill. Occasionally, I also wondered how his ex-fiancée was doing. I never learned too many details about her life after the wedding fiasco, only that she had been devastated in the immediate aftermath. The fact that Andrew had shown up at my place seemed to complicate her heartbreak, fueling insecurities about their entire relationship. But, as is the case for many heartbreak stories, time likely helped her heal. People endure and move on. I pictured her eventually finding someone far better suited, someone who would be honest and present, not haunted by past regrets. Those reflections reminded me that every relationship has two arcs, the one where you grow together and the one where you potentially grow apart. Andrew and I ultimately chose the latter. But with Ryan, I felt I was writing an entirely new narrative, one defined by transparency, trust, and mutual respect. When Andrew reappeared, it served as a test for me to reaffirm the choices I'd made, to remind myself that I was where I belonged. A year after our wedding, Ryan and I considered buying a small house outside the city. We spent weekends browsing listings, visiting open houses, and imagining where we'd place our furniture, how we'd decorate the living room, whether we'd have a garden out back. We bickered playfully about paint colors, him favoring neutrals while I leaned toward something bolder. In the midst of these everyday joys, it sometimes struck me how far I'd come from that uncertain teenager who once clung to Andrew as if he were the axis of my world. I'd grown, matured, learned from mistakes, and found a love that was healthy and balanced. In a strange way, Andrew's desperate, drunken appearance underscored that contrast. It highlighted how I no longer had space for chaos or unspoken regrets in my life. We eventually found a house with a lovely porch and a small backyard. Moving day was hectic and thrilling. Boxes upon boxes, bubble-wrapped plates, the cat weaving between our legs, me scribbling kitchen or bedroom on each package. That night, exhausted yet exhilarated, Ryan and I sat on the living room floor amidst the mess, sharing takeout and a bottle of wine. We were sweaty, our backs hurt, but we were blissfully happy. In that moment, I felt an inexplicable surge of contentment. I silently thanked the universe for guiding me through all the heartbreaks and confusion that had paved the way to this moment of simplicity and joy. Sometimes my mind drifted back to that fleeting sense of dirtiness I felt when Andrew left my apartment. It took me a while to realize it wasn't actually about him or about my relationship with Ryan. It was about how the past has a way of invading the present if we haven't fully processed it. I had processed it, at least I believed I had, but I never anticipated that Andrew might not have. When he showed up, it felt like he was dragging me into his unresolved storm, and for a moment, I was covered in its debris. That was the source of the unease. The sense that I was somehow complicit in a secret that shouldn't exist. But the secret was really his, not mine. And once he left, I managed to remind myself of that truth. From that realization, I grew even more determined to keep my emotional life uncluttered, to speak openly about issues before they turned into regrets. Ryan and I kept that promise to each other. If something bothered us, like if I was stressed about work or he was frustrated with a friend, we'd lay it out, talk it through, and find a way forward. It was a skill that might seem ordinary, but it felt revolutionary compared to the way Andrew and I used to communicate. Back then, we'd bottle things up, let them fester, or only express them in angry outbursts. Perhaps that's why I felt such a stark sense of closure with Andrew. In our relationship, the seeds of misunderstanding had been planted, and neither of us knew how to uproot them. By contrast, my marriage thrived on a willingness to face difficulties head-on. More time passed, and life continued with its usual mix of routine and surprise. Ryan's job took a demanding turn when he was promoted, which meant extra hours at the office. I explored a career shift, moving from one department to another in my company, and found new challenges that both excited and intimidated. Through it all, we leaned on each other. I told Ryan about my fears of not being competent enough for the new role, and he reassured me with unwavering belief in my capabilities. He'd come home tired, shoulders tight with tension, and I'd rub them, telling him how proud I was of his dedication. This mutual support was precisely the kind of partnership I'd once only read about in romance novels. And the more my life with him evolved, the more Andrew's memory receded to a place that no longer held pain or resentment, just a mild nostalgia and a wish for his well-being. One particularly ordinary afternoon, as I was scrolling through social media, I happened upon a photo of Andrew posted by a mutual acquaintance. He was smiling, standing near a marina, the sun setting behind him. He looked older, more grounded. In the caption, there was a mention of a new girlfriend, a new job, and a general sense that he was moving forward. I felt a small smile tug at my lips. Maybe he'd finally found some semblance of peace or happiness. I didn't reach out to him, and I had no intention of intruding on his life, but it lifted a tiny weight off my heart to see that he seemed okay. In my own small acts of introspection, I learned a great deal from that tumultuous saga. I learned that closure isn't something someone else can give you. It's something you grant yourself by acknowledging what happened, accepting it, and deciding how much power you allow it to hold over your present. Andrew's regret was a burden he carried alone, and his attempt to force a confession at my doorstep didn't really solve anything for him. Only he could address the root causes of his guilt and learn how to move on. I was just a bystander who got a glimpse into his unresolved pain. The impact on his ex-fiancée, though heartbreaking, was also a stark reminder that transparency matters. Perhaps if Andrew had been open about his lingering doubts earlier, he wouldn't have left her standing there on the day of their wedding. But this, too, was part of his journey. She, I hoped, would eventually understand it wasn't her fault, just as it wasn't mine. We were both caught up in Andrew's emotional tempest, and the only difference was that I had already moved on to a more stable shore. By the time Ryan and I celebrated our second wedding anniversary, I realized I no longer felt any trace of anxiety when I thought about Andrew. That ephemeral guilt about his meltdown had faded into a simple sense of compassion and distance. I could talk about it freely, how my ex showed up at my doorstep drunk just weeks before his own wedding, without feeling the knots of tension in my stomach. Friends would gasp at the story, calling it surreal or expressing sympathy, and I could nod calmly, acknowledging it was indeed bizarre, but that life had carried us all forward in different directions. On our second anniversary, Ryan and I traveled to a coastal town we'd never visited before. We walked the beach at twilight, waves lapping at our ankles, the sky glowing with streaks of pink and purple. At some point, he took my hand and said, "You know, sometimes I still think about that night with Andrew, how strange it was. But I also think it made me appreciate you, us." I pressed myself to his side, feeling the warmth of him. "I know. Me too," I said. We shared a gentle laugh, acknowledging that the biggest threat Andrew posed was not that he would somehow come between us, but that he embodied the importance of facing your past head-on. And we had done just that. In the following months, we planned for more significant changes. We talked about kids, about whether we wanted to wait a bit longer, or if we felt ready to start a family soon. We were at that point where life felt stable enough to welcome a new member, but we also cherished our freedom and the spontaneity we still enjoy. The conversations were honest, sometimes full of excitement, sometimes tinged with apprehension, but never filled with fear of hidden resentments or old lovers bursting in with confessions. That was not part of our story. Sometimes at night, I'd write in my journal, an old habit I'd picked up during my university days, and reflect on the winding road that led me here. Andrew was a chapter that shaped me, taught me both what I wanted and what I needed to avoid. If he had never come to my door that night, I might not have fully recognized how deep my gratitude ran for the life I was building. His presence, while unsettling, was like an exclamation point on the sentence that read, "You made the right choice." Every so often, I'd hear a whisper of a rumor about Andrew, or I'd see another photo of him through a friend's social media feed. Bit by bit, it became clear he was forging a new path. He was traveling more, dabbling in photography, and apparently had moved to a new city where he found a job he liked. I took it as evidence that people can indeed change, or at least learn from their mistakes if they're willing to confront them. Maybe he learned to let go of the past and focus on creating a future that was truly his. As for his ex-fiancée, I never encountered her again, but I did hear that she eventually started dating someone else, a year or two after the wedding that wasn't. I can only assume that she too overcame the pain of that day. Perhaps her next relationship, or the one after that, was more genuine, with fewer skeletons lying in wait. If our conversation on the phone accomplished anything, I hope it at least gave her clarity that Andrew's meltdown had nothing to do with a rekindled romance between him and me, that it was a solitary act of desperation on his part. In the end, my story with Andrew concluded not with a dramatic face-off or a reconciliatory moment, but with a soft, private acceptance that we were never meant to be. Even back when we were in love, it was a love rooted in youth, uncertainty, and an inability to communicate our deepest hopes and fears. The years that followed our breakup were transformative for both of us. I had found my soulmate in Ryan, and Andrew had been left grappling with regrets he didn't address until it was almost too late. The night he appeared at my door was like the last echo of a past that needed to be laid to rest. It was painful and uncomfortable, but ultimately it reinforced how much I valued the life I had chosen. It showed me that the love I shared with Ryan was built on something far more lasting than a teenage infatuation. It was built on shared values, respect, and a commitment to facing problems together rather than letting them fester in the dark. That, to me, is the true moral of this long, winding story. That closure is something we create within ourselves, and if we fail to do so, we risk stumbling into the present burdened by ghosts of old regrets. Andrew's story is both a warning and a testament to the resilience we humans have. Even as he lost himself in guilt and sabotaged his own wedding, he found a way back to life afterward, just as I found a deeper appreciation for what I had. If there's one last thought I'd leave to whoever hears this story, it's that sometimes the best gift you can give an ex, or anyone who once mattered to you, is a kind of gentle release, an acknowledgement that the past is the past, that you're both free to forge ahead without animosity. That doesn't mean you condone any harm they caused. It just means you refuse to carry it around like a weight. And maybe, just maybe, that's enough to keep those old ghosts from haunting you at unexpected hours. With each passing season, life continued. Ryan and I continued to grow together in our home, discussing the future, hosting barbecues for friends, enjoying quiet Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers spread across the table. I would occasionally share a memory of Andrew if it was relevant to a conversation, but more and more, he became a minor footnote. The chaos he introduced that night at my doorstep dissipated like a storm that had blown over. All that remained was the realization that I had indeed chosen the right man to stand beside through life's unpredictabilities. And so, without headings or grand announcements, without some cinematic final confrontation, my story found its quiet resolution. Andrew had once mattered, but life moved me toward my true partner, and that messy night of tears, drunken confessions, and misplaced apologies became just another anecdote, albeit one that taught me a profound lesson about love, regret, and the necessity of personal growth. In the end, the real significance lay in the journey, mine, Andrew's, and that of everyone touched by that fleeting upheaval, and the solace that comes when we finally embrace the truth about who we are, who we love, and where we truly belong.